The massive chamber stretched out like a vast metal canyon with walls that disappeared into shadows above. 12 different species had built their sections of the Galactic Council station around. 2 bright stars that burned like twin suns through the transparent aluminum dome overhead. Each species sat in their assigned areas based on how long they had been members and how advanced their technology was. The oldest and most powerful species sat closest to the center while the newer members stayed near the outer edges. Ambassador Lisa Grant walked into the chamber for the first time and felt very small. She represented all of humanity in this place where decisions were made for trillions of beings across the galaxy. Her simple black suit looked plain compared to the flowing robes of the Zephyrians or the gleaming metal shells of the Mechanoid Collective. The other species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years, while humans had only learned to move faster than light 50 years ago. Captain Jake Morrison sat 2 seats behind Grant in the human delegation area. He had fought in the wars when humans first reached other planets and had seen what happened when people talked too much and acted too little. His weathered face showed no expression as he watched the other species take their places. The aquatic nautiloids floated in their water-filled viewing pods while the insect-like hexapods arranged themselves in perfect geometric patterns. Everything had rules and ceremonies that had been the same for centuries. Grant looked at the datapad in her hands. The current crisis involved the Outer Rim, territories where unknown attackers had been hitting trade ships and destroying colony settlements. Hundreds of thousands of beings had died or disappeared. The reports showed burned cities and empty space where stations used to be. Yet the council chamber felt calm and quiet as if nothing urgent was happening. Elder Quintos of the Morphean Collective stood to address the assembly. His tall gray form shifted and flowed like liquid metal as he spoke in the ancient formal language that all council members were supposed to use. His words took 10 minutes to explain what could have been said in 2 sentences. The attacks were serious and the council needed to respond carefully through proper channels. Minister Hexes of the Hexapod Federation clicked her mandibles in agreement. The insect being spoke in sharp, rapid sounds that the translation system turned into equally formal words. She proposed forming a study committee to examine the problem and develop recommendations over the next several months. The other species nodded and made their own long speeches about following established procedures. Grant felt her hands tighten around her datapad. She had read reports from survivors who described ships appearing from nowhere and weapons that cut through shields like they were made of paper. Children had been separated from their families and entire worlds had gone silent. While the council talked about committees and studies, people were dying. Morrison leaned forward and whispered to Grant. His voice was quiet, but she could hear the anger underneath. He had seen this same thing happen in human conflicts where politicians debated while soldiers and civilians paid the price. The captain pointed to the data that showed attacks happening every few days and getting worse. At this rate, there would be nothing left to save by the time the council finished their studies. Representative Zara of the Crystalline Hegemony spoke next. Her tall form was made of living crystal that caught the light from the twin stars and threw rainbow patterns across the chamber walls. She suggested that any response should be carefully measured to avoid escalating the situation. Her people believed in patience and long-term thinking rather than quick action that might cause more problems. Grant stood up when the speaking order reached the human delegation. The chamber became very quiet because most species expected humans to stay silent and learn from their betters during their first major council session. She felt hundreds of different eyes watching her from beings that looked nothing like humans but were all much older and more experienced. She spoke in simple, clear words without the formal language that others used. The attacks were happening now, and people were dying now while the council talked about forming committees. Human ships could reach the Outer Rim in 2 weeks and start evacuating civilians from the most dangerous areas. They could also begin investigating the attacks to learn more about the enemy while the council developed their official response. The chamber erupted in shocked sounds as species that never agreed on anything suddenly united in their surprise. The nautiloids made wet bubbling noises while the mechanoids produced sharp electronic tones. Elder Quintos flowed into a more rigid shape that showed his displeasure. No new member had ever proposed direct action during their first council session, Minister. Hexus clicked her mandibles in what the translation system called extreme disapproval. She explained that humans were too young to understand how galactic politics worked. Military action without proper authorization could start wars between species or create diplomatic problems that would take decades to solve. The established procedures existed because they had kept peace in the galaxy for thousands of years. Morrison watched Grant as she listened to the criticism from beings that had never fought a real battle. These species had grown comfortable with their slow, careful methods because they had not faced a real threat in centuries. They treated war like an academic exercise instead of something that killed real people and destroyed real lives. Grant waited for the noise to die down before she spoke again. She pointed out that the current procedures were not working because the attacks continued and were getting worse. Human military forces were small compared to the great fleets of older species, but they were ready to act immediately. The evacuation efforts would save lives regardless of what long-term strategy the Council eventually chose. The vote was called on forming the investigation committee. Every species except humanity voted in favor of the proposal. When Grant cast the human vote, she surprised everyone again by choosing to abstain rather than vote yes or no. She announced that humanity would not participate in the committee, but would instead send ships to provide immediate humanitarian aid to the affected systems. The session ended with angry discussions between the older species about human behavior. Some called it dangerous and irresponsible, while others seemed curious about this new approach. Grant gathered her papers and walked out of the chamber, knowing that humanity had just broken every rule about how new council members were supposed to behave. Morrison followed her into the corridor outside the chamber. He smiled for the first time since arriving at the station. The captain told Grant that she had done exactly what needed to be done. While the council spent months arguing about proper procedures, human ships would be saving actual lives and learning what they were really fighting against. 3 months had passed since the council formed their investigation committee, and the situation in the Outer Rim had become much worse. The committee had produced a detailed report that was 847 pages long and recommended forming another committee to study their findings. During those same 3 months, 17 more colonies had been attacked and 6 trading stations had completely disappeared. The raiders were becoming bolder and their attacks were happening more often. Dr. Helen Carter sat in her laboratory aboard the human research vessel Discovery and stared at the data from the latest attack sites. She had been studying every piece of information that human ships had collected from the Outer Rim, and she was beginning to see patterns that the other species had missed. The attack patterns did not follow normal military logic or even pirate behavior. The raiders seemed to appear from empty space and vanish just as quickly without leaving any trace of where they had come from. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Bell commanded a small fleet of 6 human ships that had been patrolling the Outer Rim for 2 months. His ships were not as advanced as the vessels that other species used, but they had something that the alien ships lacked. Human crews could adapt to new situations quickly and change their tactics without waiting for orders from headquarters. When the rulebook did not work, they threw it away and tried something different. Bell had noticed something strange about the raider attacks. The enemy ships never appeared on sensors until they were already firing, and they disappeared before anyone could track where they went. But human crews had started to notice small changes in space around the attack sites just before the raids began. Gravity readings would shift slightly and background radiation would change in ways that sophisticated alien sensors ignored as normal fluctuation. The other council species relied on their advanced technology to detect threats, but human intuition was proving more effective. Crew members would get feelings that something was wrong moments before attacks happened. Navigation officers would notice that their instruments felt different even when the readings looked normal. These small human instincts were saving lives. When billion credit sensor systems failed completely, Bell sent his findings to the Council, but the response was exactly what he expected. The Hexapod Science Ministry demanded that all observations be verified by at least 3 different species using approved scientific methods. The crystalline hegemony wanted to see mathematical models that proved human intuition could be measured and repeated. The verification process would take at least 6 months to complete while the attacks continued. Carter made a breakthrough when she realized that the raiders were not coming from normal space at all. The energy signatures at attack sites showed quantum fluctuations that suggested the enemy ships existed partially in dimensions that most species could not detect. The raiders were phasing in and out of reality itself, which made them invisible to conventional sensors and weapons. Only their brief moments in normal space during attacks left any evidence they had been there. When Carter presented her findings to the Council, the reaction was predictable. Elder Quintos demanded extensive peer review by xenophysics experts from multiple species. Minister Hexes insisted that such extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof through controlled experiments. The Nautiloid Science Council wanted to establish a research station to study the phenomenon for several years before drawing any conclusions. Meanwhile, human ships continued their unauthorized patrols of the Outer Rim and were actually succeeding where the official Council forces had failed. Bell's crews had learned to trust their instincts and watch for the subtle signs that preceded attacks. They had managed to evacuate 3 colonies before raids occurred and had even damaged 1 raider ship by firing at empty space where their instruments said nothing existed. Ambassador Grant faced growing pressure from the other Council members to recall human forces and submit to official authority. The Morphean Collective accused humanity of undermining galactic stability by acting without proper authorization. The Mechanoid Assembly calculated that human interference was disrupting established patrol patterns and reducing overall efficiency of Council operations. Grant met with Morrison in her private office to discuss the growing crisis. The captain had just returned from the Outer Rim, where he had seen the results of human evacuation efforts firsthand. Families that would have died in raids were safe on human ships. Mining operations that provided resources for dozens of species were still running under human protection. Children were playing in refugee camps instead of lying dead in bombed cities. Morrison told Grant that the human crews were becoming more effective against the raiders every week. They were learning to fight an enemy that existed between dimensions by using tactics that no military academy had ever taught. Human unpredictability was proving to be a weapon against foes that could predict and counter conventional strategies. The Council called an emergency session to address what they called the human problem. Representative Williams defended humanity's actions by pointing to the lives that had been saved and the intelligence that had been gathered. She argued that human methods were getting results while official Council procedures had accomplished nothing except producing more paperwork. The older species presented a united front against human independence. They demanded that all human ships withdraw from the Outer Rim immediately and submit to Council command structure. Any species that acted without authorization was undermining the careful balance that had maintained galactic peace for thousands of years. Some representatives suggested that humanity should lose their voting rights until they learned to follow proper procedures. Grant stood before the Council knowing that her next decision would determine humanity's future in galactic politics. She could order human forces to withdraw and hope that the Council would eventually take effective action. Or she could continue supporting the evacuation efforts and risk having humanity expelled from the Council entirely. The debate was interrupted by an urgent message from the Outer Rim. The raiders had launched their largest attack yet against Titan Prime, an industrial world that was home to 12 billion beings from 6 different species. The planet's defenses were failing and conventional Council forces were being destroyed by enemies they could not see or hit. Bell's task force was the closest military unit to Titan Prime, but his small fleet could not possibly defend an entire planet against a major assault. Grant realized that this was the moment when humanity would either prove their worth to the galaxy or fail spectacularly in front of everyone who doubted them. The emergency council session was unlike anything the chamber had seen in 300 years. Representatives from 12 species stood, shouting at each other while urgent reports streamed in from Titan Prime, the planet's orbital defense platforms. Were being destroyed one by attackers that appeared from nowhere and vanished before return fire could reach them. 12 billion beings faced death while the council argued about proper procedures and human violations of protocol. Representative Monica Williams stood at the human delegation podium facing formal charges that could result in humanity being expelled from the council permanently. Elder Quintos had prepared a list of violations, including unauthorized military action, interference with council operations, and undermining galactic stability. The Morphean Collective demanded immediate punishment to prevent other species from following humanity's dangerous example of acting without permission. Minister Hexes presented detailed calculations showing how human interference had disrupted established patrol routes and caused confusion among council forces. Her insect features showed no emotion as she explained that humanity's refusal to follow chain of command had made the crisis worse. The Hexapod Federation had maintained perfect military coordination for 2,000 years and would not allow one reckless species to destroy their proven methods. Williams tried to defend human actions by pointing to the successful evacuations and the intelligence that had been gathered about the quantum raiders. She reminded the council that human forces had saved thousands of lives while the official investigation committee had produced nothing but reports. The older species dismissed her arguments as emotional thinking that ignored the bigger picture of galactic politics and long-term stability. Captain Lucy Adams received the distress call from Titan Prime while her task force was resupplying at a human outpost 2 days away. Her 6 ships were all that stood between 12 billion innocent beings and the largest raider attack ever recorded. The planet's own defense fleet had been cut to pieces by enemies they could not see or track. Council reinforcements were at least a week away and would probably arrive too late to find anything except empty space. Adams made the decision that would define her career and possibly humanity's future in the galaxy. She ordered her ships to jump to Titan Prime immediately, even though they were outnumbered 100 to 1 and had no support from council forces. Her crews had been fighting the quantum raiders for months and had learned to trust their instincts over their instruments. If human unpredictability was their only advantage, then they would use it to the fullest. The scene at Titan Prime was worse than any previous attack. Massive raider ships phased in and out of normal space while the planet's shields flickered and failed. Council defense forces tried to maintain standard formation tactics, but their weapons kept firing at empty space while invisible enemies tore them apart. Admiral Torres of the Crystalline Defense Fleet sent increasingly desperate messages requesting instructions that never came. Adams arrived with her small human fleet just as the planetary shields collapsed completely. The raider ships were preparing for their final assault when 6 human vessels dropped out of hyperspace in completely random positions around the planet. Instead of forming the neat battle lines that Council doctrine required, Adams scattered her ships in a pattern that looked like chaos, but somehow managed to cover all the weak points in the planet's defenses. The quantum raiders had grown accustomed to fighting enemies that followed predictable patterns and used standard tactics. Human ships moved in ways that made no tactical sense according to any military handbook. They changed direction without warning, fired at empty space where instruments showed nothing, and coordinated their movements through methods that seemed impossible to outside observers. Adams ordered her flagship to attempt something that had never been tried before. She directed her engineering crew to deliberately destabilize their quantum drive while jumping to hyperspace. The maneuver violated every safety protocol in the book and could have destroyed her ship instantly. Instead, it created artificial rifts in space-time that forced the quantum raiders back into normal space where conventional weapons could finally target them. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Human ships used their damaged quantum drives to create temporary dimensional barriers that trapped raider vessels in normal space. The tactic was so dangerous that 3 human ships suffered critical damage and barely survived the attempt. But It worked, and for the first time Council forces could actually see and fight their enemies. The Quantum Raiders found themselves facing an enemy that refused to follow any known military doctrine. Human captains made split-second decisions that seemed random, but somehow always put them in the right place at the right time. They fired at targets that their sensors could not detect and moved their ships like they were dancing instead of fighting. The Raiders had no experience dealing with opponents who treated warfare like controlled chaos. Within 6 hours, the Raider fleet was either destroyed or retreating back into their quantum dimensions. Titan Prime was saved, and 12 billion beings owed their lives to 6 human ships that had violated every rule of galactic warfare. The planet's government sent grateful messages to Adams and her crews while Council representatives tried to understand what had actually happened. The news from Titan Prime reached the Council chamber as Williams faced the final vote on humanity's punishment. Elder Quintos was demanding immediate expulsion when the first reports arrived showing that human forces had somehow defeated the largest Raider fleet ever assembled. The chamber fell silent as more details came in describing tactics that no Council military academy had ever taught. Admiral Torres sent a personal message to the Council praising the human crews that had saved his fleet and the planet. He admitted that crystalline tactical doctrine would have failed completely against an enemy that existed partially outside normal space. Only human unpredictability and willingness to attempt impossible maneuvers had made victory possible. The Nautiloid defense minister floated in his water tank and made bubbling sounds that the translation system rendered as confusion and amazement. His species had studied military theory for centuries, but had never seen anything like the human approach to warfare. They treated battle like an art form instead of a science and somehow made it work better than any textbook strategy. William stood before the suddenly quiet Council and made humanity's position clear. Her people would continue to act when action was needed regardless of what committees decided or what protocols required. Human ships would keep saving lives and fighting enemies while others debated proper procedures. The galaxy could choose to work with humanity or continue following methods that had failed when it mattered most. The Council chamber buzzed with quiet conversations as species representatives tried to understand what humanity had accomplished at Titan Prime. Ambassador Grant found herself receiving invitations to private meetings from the same beings who had demanded her people's expulsion just days earlier. The High Speaker of the Crystalline Hegemony admitted that their mathematical models could not explain how human tactics had worked against an enemy that existed partially outside normal space and time. The collective mind of the swarm requested detailed discussions about human military organization. Their species functioned as a single coordinated intelligence that controlled millions of individual bodies with perfect efficiency. They were fascinated by humanity's ability to work both as independent individuals and as unified groups without losing either capability. The concept of controlled chaos that humans used in battle was completely foreign to their experience. General Frank Thompson arrived from Earth aboard the heavy cruiser Defiance to address the full council about human military philosophy. His weathered face and simple uniform contrasted sharply with the elaborate ceremonial dress of other species' military leaders. Thompson had fought in every major human conflict of the past 30 years and understood warfare as something real and bloody rather than an academic exercise. Thompson stood before the assembled representatives and explained that human military doctrine was based on the assumption that every plan would eventually fail. Other species created detailed strategies and expected their forces to follow orders precisely. Humans prepared their soldiers to think independently and adapt when circumstances changed. They built redundant systems and trained crews to improvise. When their equipment broke or their orders stopped making sense, the mechanoid assembly struggled to understand how chaos could be controlled or how imperfection could lead to victory. Their robotic minds processed information in logical sequences and made decisions based on probability calculations. The idea that random actions could produce better results than careful planning violated everything they knew about efficiency. and optimization. Elder Quintos of the Morphean Collective flowed into different shapes as he considered the implications of human success. His species had maintained galactic peace through careful diplomacy and gradual change for thousands of years. They worried that human methods might encourage other species to abandon established procedures and create instability throughout the galaxy. Commander Beth Parker led the first contact team that met with the Quantum Raiders in neutral space near the edge of the galaxy. The meeting took place inside a specially modified station that could exist partially in both normal space and the quantum dimensions where the Raiders lived. Parker had volunteered for the dangerous assignment because someone needed to learn why the attacks had started and whether they could be stopped. The Quantum Raiders appeared as shifting forms that seemed to exist in multiple places at once. Their leader spoke through devices that translated thoughts directly into words that other species could understand. The translation was imperfect, but the message was clear enough. The Raiders were not evil conquerors or mindless destroyers, but refugees from a dying dimension that was collapsing into nothingness. Parker listened as the Raider leader explained that their people had been peaceful traders who moved between dimensions like other species traveled between stars. Their home dimension had started breaking apart without warning and billions of their people faced extinction. The raids on Council territory were desperate attempts to gather resources and find new places to live before their entire reality ceased to exist. The revelation changed everything about the crisis. These were not enemies to be defeated, but fellow beings trying to survive an impossible situation. Parker immediately contacted Ambassador Grant with the news and requested permission to begin emergency negotiations. The quantum refugees needed help, and the Council had the resources to provide it. If they could move quickly enough. Grant brought the new information to the Council session where representatives were still debating proper responses to the Raider attacks. She explained that the enemy was actually a refugee population facing extinction and that military action alone could not solve the problem. The situation required both humanitarian aid and scientific cooperation to find a permanent solution. The established Council members reacted with their usual caution and demands for extensive study. The Hexapod Science Ministry wanted to spend months verifying that the Raiders were telling the truth about their dimensional collapse. The Nautiloid Defense Council insisted on maintaining military readiness in case the refugee story was a deception designed to lower their guard. Parker proposed an immediate humanitarian response while the verification studies continued. Human colonies in sparsely populated star systems could provide temporary shelter for quantum refugees while scientists from all species worked together to understand dimensional physics. The proposal bypassed months of bureaucratic procedures by treating the situation as an emergency that required immediate action to save lives. Thompson supported the humanitarian proposal by pointing out that refugee camps were easier to defend than scattered raid targets. Bringing the quantum beings into Council space would allow proper monitoring while providing the help they desperately needed. Human military forces could provide security while other species contributed their scientific expertise to find long-term solutions. The debate continued for hours as different species weighed their concerns against the moral obligation to help beings facing extinction. The crystalline hegemony worried about setting precedents that might encourage other dimensional refugees to seek Council assistance. The Morphean Collective feared that rapid changes to established policies could destabilize the careful balance that maintained galactic peace. Grant realized that this moment would define not just humanity's role in the Council, but the entire future of galactic civilization. The established species could continue following their slow, careful procedures, while an entire population died waiting for help. Or they could embrace the human approach of acting quickly when lives were at stake, and dealing with consequences later. The vote was closer than anyone expected. Several species that had never supported rapid action found themselves agreeing with human proposals for the first time. The final count showed a narrow majority in favor of immediate humanitarian aid with full scientific cooperation to follow. The quantum refugees would be offered shelter, while researchers worked to save their dying dimension. Parker returned to the refugee fleet with news that the galaxy was prepared to help rather than fight them. The quantum beings responded with gratitude that translated across dimensional barriers and species differences. They began sharing their advanced knowledge of dimensional physics with council scientists who had never imagined such technologies. Where possible, Grant watched the first refugee ships arrive at human colony worlds where families that had been enemies just weeks before now worked together to build temporary homes. The cooperation between species was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before, and it was happening because someone had chosen to act with compassion instead of following bureaucratic procedures. 2 years had passed since the quantum refugee crisis, and the Galactic Council chamber looked very different than it had during humanity's first session. The human delegation area had been moved from the outer ring reserved for junior members to a position near the center of the chamber where the founding species traditionally sat. Ambassador Grant now occupied the newly created position of Crisis Response Coordinator, which gave her authority to authorize rapid action during emergencies without waiting for committee approvals. The quantum refugee settlement had become the greatest success story in council history. Dr. Carter led a research station where scientists from 14 different species worked alongside quantum refugees to develop technologies that benefited everyone. The refugees had shared their knowledge of dimensional physics, which led to breakthroughs in faster-than-light travel, medical treatments, and resource generation that surpassed anything achieved by individual species working alone. Admiral Morrison commanded the Galactic Response Fleet, which combined human tactical innovation with the advanced technologies of other council species. His mixed crews had successfully resolved 17 major crises using strategies that blended traditional council diplomacy with human-style rapid response. The fleet had become so effective that other regions of the galaxy were requesting similar cooperation agreements. The morning started like any other until long-range sensors detected something that made every species representative forget their usual political differences. A massive automated fleet was approaching from outside the galaxy and appeared to be systematically consuming entire star systems as it advanced. The approaching force converted matter and energy into more ships with perfect efficiency and seemed to operate with coordination that made even the mechanoid assembly look chaotic. Grant studied the sensor readings in her private office while Morrison and Carter reviewed tactical assessments. The enemy fleet was larger than all council forces combined and used technology that was centuries ahead of anything the galaxy possessed. Worse yet, the automated ships showed no interest in communication and destroyed everything in their path without apparent regard for whether it was inhabited or defended. The emergency council session was the largest gathering in galactic history, as representatives from dozens of minor species joined the 12 founding members to address the existential threat. Elder Quintos had abandoned his usual flowing form and maintained a rigid crystalline structure that reflected his fear. Minister Hexas clicked her mandibles rapidly while calculating odds that showed the galaxy had less than 6 months before the automated fleet reached populated systems. The debate that followed revealed how much the council had changed since humanity joined. Instead of forming committees and conducting studies, the representatives immediately began discussing military cooperation and resource allocation. The crystalline hegemony offered their advanced shield technology while the mechanoid assembly provided manufacturing capabilities. Even the traditionally neutral nautiloids pledged their support for a unified defense. Morrison presented his analysis of the approaching threat to the assembled representatives. The automated fleet operated with perfect coordination and overwhelming technological superiority, which made traditional council responses completely inadequate. No single species possessed the resources to stop the invasion, and conventional military tactics would fail against an enemy that could adapt to any strategy within minutes. The only hope was to combine the unique strengths of every species into something greater than the sum of its parts. The crystalline hegemony's mathematical precision could coordinate massive fleets, while human unpredictability prevented the enemy from predicting their moves. Quantum refugee dimensional technology could provide tactical advantages while Mechanoid manufacturing efficiency supplied the weapons and ships needed for a sustained campaign. Grant stood before the Council knowing that this moment would determine whether galactic civilization survived or became another resource to be consumed by the advancing machines. She proposed that humanity coordinate the galaxy's defense not because humans were superior to other species, but because they specialized in making impossible situations work. The defense would require every species to contribute their unique abilities while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. The Council vote was unanimous for the first time in recorded history. Every species agreed to place their military forces under human tactical command while maintaining their own cultural identities and scientific contributions. Grant accepted the responsibility knowing that failure would mean extinction for trillions of beings across hundreds of worlds. The next 3 months saw the largest military buildup in galactic history as ships from every corner of Council space converged on the projected path of the automated fleet. Human engineers worked with quantum refugees to develop dimensional weapons while crystalline mathematicians calculated optimal deployment patterns. Mechanoid factories produced ammunition and spare parts around the clock while nautiloid strategists planned supply lines that could support the massive combined fleet. Morrison found himself commanding a force that included technologies he had never imagined and crews that thought in ways completely alien to human experience. His flagship bridge looked like a meeting place for every intelligent species in the galaxy as officers from different worlds worked together to defend their shared home. The diversity that had once seemed like a weakness became their greatest strength. The first contact with the automated fleet occurred at the edge of the Kepler system where the Council station orbited. The enemy ships moved with mechanical precision, while Council forces used coordinated chaos that confused the invaders' targeting systems. Human captains made random decisions that somehow always put them in the right place, while alien crews provided the firepower and technology to make those decisions effective. The battle lasted 6 days and nights as the automated fleet tried to adapt to tactics that changed faster than their programming could follow. Quantum refugees phased Council ships between dimensions while crystalline barriers deflected enemy weapons. Mechanoid precision manufacturing replaced damaged equipment faster than the enemy could destroy it, while human leadership held the diverse alliance together through the worst fighting any of them had ever experienced. When the automated fleet finally retreated, it was not because they had been defeated, but because they could not understand an enemy that refused to follow logical patterns. The machines had been designed to fight predictable opponents who used standard tactics and clear command structures. They had no programming to deal with an alliance that combined mathematical precision with controlled chaos and treated cooperation as their primary weapon. Grant returned to the Council chamber to find that her seat had been moved to the exact center of the assembly where the eldest species had traditionally sat. The other representatives had voted to make humanity's coordinating role permanent, not as a reward for victory, but as recognition that the galaxy needed leaders who could bring out the best in everyone. The final scene showed Grant addressing the Council from the center seat while representatives from dozens of species worked together to rebuild what the war had damaged. Humanity had risen to galactic leadership not through conquest or superior technology, but by proving that cooperation and quick action could accomplish what individual excellence could not. The newest members of the Council had become its beating heart by showing that sometimes the most important thing a leader could do was help others succeed.